Hi, Aaron Holt from Lead the Generation. So excited to be a part of Boost 2023. I want to talk in this session about your personal leadership growth. And this session is entitled The 4 Barriers to Leadership Growth. Years ago, I had the opportunity to go on a climb to raise money for missions for Speed of Light. It was Mount Kilimanjaro. And it took about a year for us to prepare for the climb and raise all the money for it. But during the preparation phase, there was these different professional mountain guides that would jump on a conference call and they would coach us in various areas. And one such call was on gear. It was on the type of gear that we needed to acquire or buy in order to increase our success of making it to the top, to summit. And there was one phrase that the guide kept using again and again. He said, just remember, on the mountain, there's no such thing as bad weather, just bad gear. And I didn't really understand what that phrase meant, no bad weather, just bad gear, until I actually got on the mountain and I started experiencing all the bad weather, at which point I started to realize I got bad gear. I should have listened better because now I'm in a bad situation. Had I made the right choice or decision to get the right gear, I'd be much further along to be able to face the challenges of climbing this mountain. Leadership in your life, in my life, again, regardless of your role right now, volunteer, part-time, full-time, leadership in my life, in your life is often like climbing a mountain. And there's good pieces of gear and there's bad pieces of gear. I want to talk about 4 barriers or 4 bad pieces of gear and their antidote, or the right piece of gear that you want as a leader in order to help yourself out, in order to help put you in a position where you're constantly growing. I love this quote right here. This is from Jeannie Mayo. She says this: without the choice of continuous growth in your life, you are painfully close to being the best that you'll ever be. That kind of scares me, right? Because I got this thing in me as a leader where I'm like, I want to grow. I want to get better. So 4 barriers. Here we go. Number 1, ego. That's a barrier, right? And here's what ego sounds like in your life and in my life. Ego sounds like this sentence right here: I know more than anyone else. I'm the smartest person in the room. I'm probably a little better than everyone else. I'm more gifted. That's ego. I love how Gerald Brooks breaks it down, the word ego. He says ego is edging God out. Edging God out. And then he goes on and he says this. He says, when your ego grows, your need for God goes, right? This is ultimately what the prophet Samuel said about Saul in the Old Testament. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 7. It was said to King Saul, you were great when you were small in your own eyes. So ego is the bad piece of gear. That's the barrier. What do we want? The antidote, so to speak, is to keep a humble heart. Keep a humble heart. I would suggest to you that humility is the great life extender for leaders. It's what keeps you in the game, so to speak. So let me give you a good coaching question here that you can talk about in your group. What is one thing I can do on a weekly basis to keep my heart humble? What's one thing I can do to keep my heart humble? Do it on a weekly basis. It's an intentional choice. Barrier number 2, bad piece of gear. Number 2, you don't want this piece of gear right here. Number 2, entitlement. Entitlement sounds like this: I am the exception to the rule, right? I'm the exception to the rule. And we often do this if we have a little bit of a spirit of entitlement. We tend to judge ourselves by the motives of our heart, but we judge others by our interpretation of their actions. Right? That's what a spirit of entitlement does. It says, I'm the exception of the rule. It doesn't apply to me, whatever. Right? So as a leader and you're leading in student ministry, and it doesn't matter, again, whether you're doing it volunteer, part-time, full-time, this applies across the board. Whatever you lead with, you ultimately will multiply. Whatever you lead with, you ultimately will multiply. This is an issue of culture in your ministry. Culture is a combination of 2 things. It's your beliefs and your behavior. Typically, most of us in church settings have the right belief system, right? But it's our behavior, or the gap between belief and behavior, that creates the unhealthy culture, right? And so Be careful about the spirit of entitlement that says, I'm the exception, because whatever you're leading with, you'll begin to multiply. So what's the antidote, or what's the good piece of gear that we want to get? We want to keep a servant's mentality. We want to keep a servant's mentality. I love what Doug Clay, our general superintendent, said. He said, if serving is beneath you, then leadership is beyond you. Even of Jesus, it was said of Jesus in Matthew chapter 20, verse 28. It says, Jesus came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So here's a coaching question for you. What's one thing I can do on a weekly basis to keep and develop a servant's heart? And I would suggest to you that the one thing you choose probably needs to be anonymous. Because there is nothing like serving in anonymity where you know you're never going to get a pat on the back for it, to help keep you not only away from entitlement, but also keep you humble, what we talked about in the first part. Number three, the third barrier, third bad piece of gear, laziness. Laziness. Here's what laziness sounds like. Laziness says, I don't need it. Or laziness says, I can get away with it, right? Or laziness says, I've never needed it before, so I probably won't need it again, right? February 1st, 2003. Some of you were around at that date. Some of you read about it, right? But February 1st, 2003, that was the day that the spaceship Columbia, the shuttle Columbia, had a tragic accident where just about a minute or so after takeoff, it completely erupted. And after they did all the testing to find out why, after years and years of, honestly going through all the data, collecting all the parts and everything, they came to the conclusion that the reason that there had been a tragic accident was because a piece of ice that had formed over the hull of the ship, which typically happens all the time overnight, right? A piece of ice had fallen off and it had hit a foam heat shield, right? Now, one might say, why in the world would a multi-million-dollar spaceship have foam as heat shield? Well, because in testing, 17 times in testing, foam had been hit by ice, but it had never caused a catastrophic result. So NASA calls this, they have a phrase for this, they call this a successful failure. It was a failure because the ice actually hit the foam, but it was successful because it didn't cause a catastrophe or didn't cause a problem. That's what laziness does in your life and my life as a leader. Laziness says it's never caused a problem before, so it probably will never cause a catastrophic problem in the future, right? Laziness says this, I can do something wrong because in the past it's never produced immediate consequences or results. And so laziness assumes that because it never caused a problem before, it will never cause a problem in the future. It's danger. It's danger. It's a lot of danger. So what's the antidote to this? What's the good piece of gear? You have to keep a disciplined life. You have to keep a disciplined life. And I would say to you, again, somebody who's been doing full-time ministry for 2 decades, almost 3 decades now, the longer you serve as a leader, the more disciplined you need to become, not less, right? So here's the coaching question for you. What's one discipline I need to add to my life? Don't overwhelm yourself with 5 or 10 or 20. Just one. What's one discipline I need to add to my life? Number 4, last barrier to growth here as a leader. Number 4, complacency. Complacency. Here's what complacency sounds like. It says this, I've done enough. I have done enough. I've already served. I've already given. I've already gone. I've done enough. I've given more than I needed to give. I've done enough, right? And here's what happens when complacency sets itself in your heart or my heart as leaders. Complacency often leads me to a place of compromise, right? And that's what Paul is actually talking about in Romans chapter 12, verse 1 and 2. He says to present ourselves as living sacrifices. That means I'm still alive, but I'm still making sacrifices, right? I'm always giving, I'm always going, right? So how do we avoid or hold back the barrier of complacency that wants to creep up inside of all of us as leaders, especially those of you that have been doing it for a while? Here's the antidote. Keep a sacrificial spirit. keep a sacrificial spirit, right? That means I'm going to go and keep on going and give and keep on giving, right? I'm going to be a person who resists that barrier in my life. So just remember, when you're climbing the leadership mountain, there's no bad weather. There's just bad gear. There's just bad gear, right? And so what I'd encourage you to do in your group when you sit here and you talk, right? And even for this last one on complacency, ask yourself, here's the coaching question. What's one uncomfortable thing you can do to promote growth in your life or in your leadership, right? But ultimately, take all four of these barriers and just choose one. Like pick one that you say, this is the one God wants me to work on today. If you pick all four, you're probably not going to do any of them, right? So just choose one and say, I got to work on this one today, and I'm going to take that coaching question, and I'm going to work on applying that to my life and doing that on a weekly basis so that I can start to grow in this area. And once you begin to grow there, then you can come back and you can hit one of the other ones, right? So, all right, I hope that blesses you. I hope that encourages you, challenges you. Have a great conversation in your groups. Thanks for letting me invest in you today.